Chapter 6. The Lebuhunias Sfagnome, Sfagov Marquisate. The Sfagov Marquisate was founded in the year 648 IH Imperial history. Soziek Silar Dagliai started the campaign on Yaktia as Glaharer Byrer, fleet commander-in-chief, and was appointed its lord upon distinguishing himself with success. The Sfagov star system possessed 7 main planets, the third of which had seemed suitable for human settlement were terraforming to be carried out. Its atmosphere was chiefly composed of carbon monoxide, with little hydrogen to speak of, but that proved no impediment. Dagliai, the first Bear Sfagnome, Viscount of Sfagov, named the planet after the coat of arms of his house of Soziek, the Iad Krihena le Klasber, silver branch and snail, before embarking on the planet's terraforming, Klasbule, was one derived transliteration. There was a standard sequence for birthing a new habitable planetscape. First came fundraising. Terraforming demanded large sums of capital, but in the absence of some gross oversight, there was guaranteed money in it, so there was seldom ever a shortage of potential investors. Dagliai, however, skipped that first step entirely. Thanks to successive generations of investment, the Soziek family had amassed a sizable fortune, obviating the need to seek outside sources of seed money. Second came the work of terraforming itself. The empire boasted several Gerarek Phaser Daiwimr, planetary terraforming engineering unions, taking on contracts to oversee the process from the preliminary exploration phase to the crafting of the ecosystem. One such Gerarek union came to Klasbule and set about altering the orbit of an icy planet on the perimeter of the star system such that it collided with Klasbule. This covered the planet in water vapor, rinsing the ground through the resulting cataracts of rain. Rivers emerged. Oceans came into being. Next to be sown were the algae and the microorganisms centered around them. Those microorganisms exploded in number, absorbing carbon and leaving behind oxygen in their wake. Their husks would go on to pile up on the planet's rocky surface, becoming soil. Then higher-class plant life was introduced. Strains like Ronreb, Sansod, and Rhodoremzoek, imitation lava pines, which matured quickly and could plant roots even in poor-quality soil, were the principal species. The plants raised the soil's water retention capacity, synthesizing abundant organic matter from inorganic beginnings. Subsequently, with each new generational transition of the plant life, the soil became more fertile, eventually allowing for the successful sowing of species that require a richer environment. Fish, too, were introduced to the seas and lakes, while annelids, insects, and other crawlies were unleashed upon the land. The evolution that took billions of years to develop on Earth of old had been truncated to an extreme extent through a handful of different processes, and the order of said developments had been adjusted for heightened convenience and efficiency. On the 50th year, a comprehensive ecosystem including higher-order mammals had been instated, thus marking the completion of an inhabitable planet. Typically, that was when colonization would take place. In this case, however, scant effort was made to solicit for settlers. By that time, reign over the planet had been passed down to the second Viscount of Sfagov, Disclay, a man who felt no pressing urge to people his freshly terraformed planet with surface citizens. As to why, the public is still not privy. Perhaps he saw the planet as a garden or park. If that was indeed the case, then his driving desires were brazen by the standards of the kin of the stars. It was commonplace among the off to take pride in counting the universe itself as their home, and even grandees only rarely left their orbital estates to visit the terrestrial world below. If an Ov appeared to want to claim a surface world for themselves, it would be cause for scandal. It was therefore only reasonable that that wouldn't be disclosed. There was, however, a more favorable way of viewing the matter as well. He was waiting to see whether intelligent life would naturally evolve and serve as the planet's territorial citizens. If that was true, then he was mad in the singularly of fashion, leaving aside the baffling lack of pride he showed in his own Boreac Sfagnome, Viscount estate of Sfagov. Whatever the case, migration to the planet began with the peerage of the third Viscount of Sfagov, Etlii. Agreements were reached with the Lords and Semiexos, or territorial civilian governments, of 13 territory nations that were facing impending overpopulation, and a settler recruitment office was opened. The first day of the first month of the Clasbial calendar coincided with the 29th day of the 11th month of the year 729 IH. Viscount Etlii was made a count thanks to his deed of adding a new inhabited planet to the empire, and he joined the ranks of grandees. What was formerly the Viscountdom of Svagov was now the Drohioniu Svagnome, Countdom of Svagov. 93 years after settlement began, the population reached the 100 million mark, thereby warranting an upgrade to Marquisate. At present, the population of Clasbial is around 380 million. It has 21 states, with an assembly of state premiers comprised of same-sauce or territorial citizen representatives. Rattled off Jinto's Kompuachas, seated atop a hill, he scanned his surroundings. Or perhaps it was not so much as a hill as a giant piece of pumice, a big, holy boulder. It was nothing but crops as far as the eye could see, in all directions, rows of the exact same plant running down to the horizon and beyond. Even now, following the advent of hydroponic farming, making use of the naturally occurring water and light on a planet's surface was still the cheapest method of food production, even counting the upfront cost of planetary terraforming. From up on this hill, they really did look like wheat. Granted, that could be because that was the grain he was most used to. They could very well be a genetically engineered giant strain similar to but distinct from wheat. Whatever. It's wheat, he decided. It's not like it changed their situation. Gusts of wind made the fields rustle in surging waves, swaying from right to left, a virtual sea of gold. Meanwhile, the hill of pumice jutted out from it all like a remote isle. To the distant right stood another isle, which looked to be a forest. Something was circling above that forest. Local planetary transport? Or maybe. All in all, the scene before them was idyllic. One would never expect this to be a war zone. It was early evening now. They had spent all the night prior running, and dawn was cracking when they stumbled across the hill. By that point they were worn out. Luckily, they'd found a hole in the pumice face so big it was nearly a cave, and they slipped in for some much-needed sleep. Leifir was, of course, just as exhausted as he was. Given their situation, taking shifts standing vigil should have been a matter of course. In fact, Jinto had meant to stand vigil without ever having told Leifir. But the exhaustion had seeped into his very marrow, and sleep swallowed him up in no time. He'd only finally awakened moments ago. The reason he'd left Leifir's still dozing side to climb to the top of the hill was to survey their environs. Jinto shut off the informational audio and tried tuning into the spot broadcasting frequency. A middle-aged woman's face displayed on his small screen. She was orating on something or other. At first, he didn't understand a word she said. There was no data regarding languages on the connecting vessel's limited memory bank, nor was his CompuWatch equipped with a translator function. But as he focused on the words, he realized it was, in fact, Baranu. We need, think, organization, humankind, rule, unite. Reason, they freed us, leave, control, belong. Oh. Now, we need, stand, independent, government, belong, us, resemble, truly. Thus, Jinto picked it up. This was not the standard Baranu that was the official language of all the empire, but rather a simplified pidgin. The complicated-looking declension of Baranu had been removed. Now grammatical meaning was determined by word order. Moreover, that word order was the same as Martinese. So, once he'd gotten used to the Clasbial accent, of was now oh, he started grasping the gist of her address. Of course, words of seemingly non-Baranu origin were also sprinkled throughout, but he could still understand the overall thrust of the sentences. To sum it up, this lady was saying, let us give thanks to the united humankind, who have liberated us from overrule. That such a broadcast made it to air could only mean the star forces had been defeated. Jinto was quick to come to grips with that fact. He'd already steeled himself to the eventuality. All he could really do was wait until the Empire reclaimed the land. Jinto fiddled with the frequency to see whether he could turn the channel. He was greeted by footage of a cityscape. It was most likely a movie. A smirk formed. Really? Entertainment? At a time like this? On second thought, maybe it was a form of resistance in itself. After all, the whole planet had been built up by the Off to begin with, just like Dulctu. The population was composed of the descendants of those migrants who had already accepted of rule. Unlike a planet like Martinu, which had been conquered, anti-Ov sentiment here was probably sparse. Actually, the planet was perhaps altogether indifferent. Cosmic-scale conquest likely held no interest to ordinary surface folks. Incidentally, the garb the people wore in the movie caught Jinto's eye more than the plot. There was no differentiation by gender and of fashion. Males and females alike wore jumpsuits. Here on Klasbule, however, it seemed jumpsuits were for males, while females wore simpler one-piece dresses and knee-high boots. He tuned away from the transmission, deciding instead to determine their location. He set the device to receive signals from several different location markers on the planet's surface and cross-reference them against the map he'd booted from the vessel's computing crystals. He discovered a city named Lune not too far away. In mentally matching the surrounding landscape with the map displayed on his CompuWatch, he came to understand the forest floating in the sea of gold was not a forest at all. Question is, do we try to blend in there, or do we stick to the fields? Jinto mulled it over. He only had 9 meals worth of rations left. Even if he spaced those meals out, he'd run out in 5 days, tops. Procuring more food here was their only option. However, while this stretch of land was evidently a plantation, he had no idea how to harvest the crops and no tools to make them fit for consumption. That, and he shuddered to think of how many days they'd be spending sleeping out in the open. It would be hard enough for Jinto, who'd grown up on a terrestrial world. It'd be even harder for Lefier, who'd been brought up in an artificial environment. It was settled. Hiding out in Lune was the way forward. Viewed from here, the city seemed small and unreliable, but there was bound to be public transport that'd take them to bigger cities. Dusk had arrived, and so Jinto clambered down the hill. It wasn't too high up, but it was a steep slope. Additionally, though there were plenty of holds for his hands and feet, the pumice was brittle. Any foothold could easily give way. After many a close call, Jinto made it to the base of the hill. He wrapped around the base and knelt down to enter the hole, only to find he was face to face with a gun. "It's me, Lefier," he said, hands up. "Where were you?" she said, putting it back. "Just want to do a little scouting." "I didn't ask you what you were doing. I asked you where you were." "Man, you're literal." "I was atop the hill." "You idiot." "What?" he replied, flabbergasted. "What if they'd seen you?" "It's okay. Nobody's here." "They could be standing watch from above." "Oh yeah. No doubt there were enemy ships scanning the surface from orbit as they spoke. They could, in fact, have spotted him. But I'm telling you, I'm in the clear. I'm not wearing a long robe. They'd see me as a resident of the planet. You can't rely on the enemy making a mistake." "All right, fine. I won't be so rash again. Promise." "Good. Don't leave me without saying a word." "You were sleeping so soundly, though. Speaking of which, I guess I still haven't said good morning, so." "Good morning, Lefier. Though I guess it's already dark out." "Idiot. Grumpy much?" Jinto shrugged. "Guess even she can be childish sometimes." "Wanna move base, just in case," he suggested. "Yes, I believe that would be wise." "I can't say staying here would be anything but dull, anyway," she said, on her feet now. After tiding themselves over with some food, they set about preparing to leave. Jinto picked up the small apparatus that had been placed over by the far end, a machine that converted moisture into potable water. Sure enough, its container was filled to the brim. He poured its contents into 2 flasks and handed one to Lefier. Knapsack strapped on, the two put the hill in which they'd spent one night of their lives behind them. Jinto broke the silence as they trudged on. "I reckon we head into the city." "The city?" "Yeah. Beats playing hide-and-seek in the fields, anyway. I'd like to rejoin civilization at some point." "But won't it be dangerous?" "For sure it will be," Jinto replied. What was he going to do, lie? "But it's hardly safe out here, either. I'm not the Honorable Baron Emeritus of Febdash, but I'll tell you what he did. I don't know what the way forward is. That said, there's no food here." I don't know if you like the idea of starving to death in the middle of nowhere, but to me it's gotta be the second least dignified way to go. You're right, said Lefier. Her voice was lacking its usual verve. You're still tired, aren't you, Lefier? I am no such thing, she snapped. Why would you say that? Just asking. Phew. There's the hot-tempered girl I know, he thought, relieved. But tell me when you are, okay? I told you, I'm not tired. Yeah, huh. The dark of night grew ever thicker, and finally the sun sank entirely. Jinto. Her voice sounded from behind. Go on a little ahead of me. Why? He spun to face her, surprised. Don't ask. Her face had turned grim in the starlight. What do you mean, don't ask? Look around, there's no landmarks anywhere. What if we lose sight of each other? Fine, then you should wait here. Sure, but I've still gotta know why. And I said don't ask. Jinto's unease only mounted. Had she stumbled across some fresh new reason to play the martyr? He was duty-bound to disabuse her of whatever false notion she might be operating under. Listen, Lefier, Jinto proceeded to speechify as to the nature of working in tandem. No keeping secrets, no trying to solve problems alone. They were to come up with their next steps together. That was the meaning of camaraderie. They had to overcome this crisis by joining forces and… Lefier was listening at first, but gradually her brows slanted into a dangerous V. Jinto, you are officially dumber than a pack of frozen vegetables, she cried at last. Just wait there and look away. A certain torpor assailed Jinto as he watched her stomp off into a row of wheat. Then he hastily averted his gaze. In this darkness, she wouldn't have been visible anyway, but it was incumbent upon him to respect the wishes of a blushing maiden. Of course. Yes, she was beautiful as a sculpture. Yes, she was a relative of the Empress who ruled over 900 billion Rubisar, imperial subjects. But she was still a creature of physiological needs. Jinto's legs turned to jelly, and he fell to a seat next to the base of some more giant wheat. How could he let himself get so carried away? What a buffoon he was. Meanwhile, at that very moment, a reconnaissance spaceship belonging to the peacekeeping force of the United Humankind named DV-903 was hard at work analyzing video of the surface, and discovered a surface landing hull of an Imperial Star Forces ship in the farmland outside the city of Lune Biga. The work crew had attempted to place where it had come from, but without success. Records of the small vessel that had given 3 destroyers the slip in normal space after dodging a warship's fire in flat space had gotten buried amidst all the other records detailing the huge and intricate battlefield. Gaining total control of an entire star system was no easy feat. Of course, it would have only been a matter of time before they identified it fully, but there was a lot on their plate. The work crew surmised that the majority of soldiers left to find were escapees of the liaison base or the Lord's estate. They'd also ascertained that, judging by the state of the hull, its erstwhile occupants were still alive. They relayed that to intelligence, but HQ had given the matter a very low priority level. After all, it had already been determined that all the key figures of the Marquisate and the liaison base had already been captured or killed. Whoever the owner of this hull was, they weren't worth a frenzied hunt over. Moreover, the Leda-Faklax Fagnome, Svagov Marquisate Defense Corps, the personal forces of the Lobeg-X Fagnome, estate of the Marquis of Svagov, were still holding the line in a few zones on the surface, and many important government figures were still on the lam as well. The investigation teams were all out, equipped with odor detectors. Devoting manpower to tracking down 1 or 2 people who'd crash-landed would be a waste of effort. First, they needed to conquer the planet more firmly and arrest and detain any and all individuals who had aided the Empire's reign. Thus, they'd beat the populace back into servility. The Star Force's soldier-hunting job would make for a fine accompaniment to the greater labor. Their prey was helpless anyway. Whoa! Jinto came to a halt. He could hear the dirt fall in clumps down away from his feet. It was a ravine. Jinto had teetered on the cliff's edge. What is it? Said Lefier. It's a dead end. And the sun wasn't peeking out anytime soon. Jinto screwed his eyes against the darkness, trying to measure the gap, but there just wasn't enough light to make out what lay ahead. He turned on his CompuWatch's flashlight function, but illuminating the ground around him was the best it could manage. Suddenly, light poured out from the vicinity. A powerful searchlight was cast upon the opposite side of the gorge. Leifir was brandishing her phaser at the ready. The beam was coming from its muzzle. "How do you do that?" asked Jinto, pulling out his own gun. "I showed you where the safety is. Set it between safe and loaded. That's where the flashlight function is." "Really should have pointed out a feature that convenient at some point," carped Jinto. "It slipped my mind." "I see. Using a gun as a flashlight was not an everyday occurrence." Jinto set the safety to flashlight and pulled the trigger. The gap was larger than he'd imagined. It was at least a U-stag in breadth. The diagonally carved precipice wound wide indeed. Deep, however, it was not, measuring only around 500 dag top to bottom. There was giant wheat growing at the bottom of the canyon, too. He could look down on the ear tips. "It's looking pretty rough," he said, holstering it back into his sash belt and leaning over to scan the cliff. The drop wasn't totally vertical, but it was too steep to walk down. Meanwhile, the climb back up looked easier. If they didn't watch themselves on the descent, they could easily tumble and plummet. Jinto took off his knapsack and rummaged through it. "We got a rope or something in here?" "There should be a rurjuak, carbon crystal fiber." "Sounds usable." "Where is it?" Leifir's hand extended from the side and took something rod-like out from Jinto's knapsack. She spun it deftly in hand. "So, what do I do with this?" "You need to ask," he said, taken aback. "We're gonna use it to make our way down." "Hand it over a sec." Jinto took the rod and inspected it. Though it was of course military issue, it took after the same general principle as the Yomserai carbon crystal fiber spindle he'd used on Delk. The fiber was contained within the rod's core, and fast-drying gain, synthetic resin, occupied a good part of both ends. Fibers of cheaper make might only be usable when uncovered, or be covered from the outset by a coating. This fiber, however, was high quality. One could choose whether to apply a coating based on the circumstances. Moreover, the hook attached to the fiber's tip was versatile and could be remotely controlled. The star forces could be counted on to spare no expense, even on auxiliary items. Jinto strung the hook as he applied the coating on the fiber. Then he had it snake its way over to the base of the giant wheat and hook on. "All right, I'll go first." Jinto gripped the spindle, turned his back, and lowered a leg. He let out the fiber little by little and rappelled down the cliff. He made his last leap after confirming the ground was a mere 50 dag below via the light of the CompuWatch. "It's your turn, Leifir," Jinto shouted, looking up at the top of the precipice. He then set the spindle to automatically wind itself back and let go. The spindle smoothly climbed back up the cliff as it scattered the coating scraped off the fiber. "I'm jumping," she said, conveying her determination with heft and import. Leifir descended with a great big swoosh. It looked as though she'd left carbon crystal fiber unreeled. Jinto rushed to her side. You okay?" "Of course I am," she said, her face contorted with pain. "I told you, you've got to stop overdoing it." Jinto offered her a hand up. "I am not overdoing it," she insisted, dismissing the hand. "If you say so." Jinto unhooked the line via remote control and rewound it. The shavings of synthetic resin piled up at his feet. When he'd finished winding it back up, he used his gun once again to illuminate the cliff's underside. "What are you doing?" "Looking for a new lodge for the night. Got to be far enough away now. And looky here." "A cave." Jinto beckoned her, and together they drew closer to their fresh accommodations. It was quite extensive. They couldn't see its far wall even using the phaser's flashlight. Jinto kept the cave's depths illuminated, on the lookout for some hidden, lurking threat, but as far as he could see, no such cause for concern was to be found. Jinto laid down his knapsack and summoned the map on his CompuWatch. It told him they were under 50 U-stag from Lundbiga now. Soon, it was mealtime for the two. Jinto went into his plan while munching on some more nearly tasteless combat rations. "I'm gonna go check out the city, but I'll be back." "By yourself?" Leifir raised her brows. Yeah. Duh. Why? Is there a reason I can't go?" "You're wearing a military uniform," he pointed out. "What do you think'll become of somebody wearing a Star Forces uniform in an enemy-occupied town?" It never crossed her mind? For real? I mean, There's naive, and then there's naive. But Jinto kept those misgivings to himself. That's why I'm gonna be getting you something to wear that won't stand out. I'll zip in and out as quickly as possible, so wait for me here. A fire kindled in her eyes. Jinto was flustered. What had sparked her ire now? Had he said something untoward? No. He was making all the sense in the world, and besides, if she thought differently, she should tell him otherwise. The way she was glaring at him was uncalled for. Yet he was surprised when Leifier nodded. Okay, good. Jinto washed down the last crumbs of his rations with some water and got up off the ground. You're leaving already? Yeah. The earlier the better. You might be rushing straight into ruin. No need to remind me. Half of me's sure I am. Jinto retrieved the sash clip from his knapsack and put it inside his jumpsuit's pocket. He also decided to take 3 meals worth of rations with him. The rest he left behind. The issue was his CompuWatch. His model was the standard for the Empire, but it was rare across terrestrial worlds. The sharp-sighted among the people might find him out just through that. Naturally, they wouldn't jump to the conclusion that he's a noble, but they might think him a left imperial citizen. He would be pretending to be a sauce territorial citizen, so that was an outcome he aimed to avoid. On the other hand, the CompuWatch was a very convenient tool in his arsenal. After all, he needed to be able to contact Leifier if an emergency arose. In the end, he elected to place it, too, into his pocket. You're not taking the gun? She asked, incredulous. This was no time for jokes. Jinto could only shrug. If I get caught in a shootout, I'm a goner, gun or no gun. So you'd rather just give up? Don't make me out like that. If they catch me carrying a Star Forces gun on me, they'd have me dead to rights. I see. Glad you see it my way, Jinto sighed. But some trepidation lingered in him, not regarding his situation, fraught with peril as it was, but rather regarding leaving her to her own devices. Up among the stars, he'd thought of the girl as a hyper-competent exemplar, but now he'd witnessed how little thought she put in things that were the most basic common sense for him. Don't worry, she'll be fine, he persuaded himself. Leifier may have been lacking in everyday practicality, but that was only problematic when she was around others. Of course, it would be a different story once she stepped foot into the city herself, but for now, she was more than capable of taking care of herself as long as she was out of sight. But how likely is it no one will spot her? After all, it was quite possible a search party was already closing in on them, which would raise its own set of fears. Due to its nature, the Star Forces didn't put much emphasis on acting solo. It would be difficult for a single soldier, especially one without the relevant training, to be sufficiently mindful. Of course, Jinto hadn't the training either, but he did have a strong suit the Av were blind to. There was no way anyone could tell he was nobility unless he divulged it himself. If push came to shove, he could talk himself out of a dicey situation by claiming to be an imperial citizen. On a nation as large as Sfogov, there had to be a considerable number of imperial citizens. Besides, it wasn't as though the enemy would exhibit that much interest in one nation's citizenry anyway. By contrast, Leifier's blue hair and Empire-issue military uniform were dead giveaways. Jinto would have liked to see the idiot who wouldn't cotton on straight away. Leifier getting spotted by somebody was the greatest crisis they could face at the moment. Jinto was stumped until he hit upon a primitive alarm system. Be careful when you're out of the cave, all right? With that, Jinto let out the carbon crystal fiber, sans coating. He wedged a protruding rock onto the hook at about knee height. He set the fiber to be covered in the coating and let it out to a suitable length, holding it taut horizontally. Then he fastened the part of the line coated in the synthetic resin onto a protrusion on the opposite end. What is that for? It's a trap. It'll alert you if somebody comes too close, he explained, pointing to the non-coated fiber. Not only is it invisible, it's sharper than any blade, too. So if somebody doesn't think better than popping in, then Gaia. Their legs sliced clean off. Now that's tight security. Leifier cocked her head. What if an innocent falls for the trap? That he hadn't thought of. To call the act of attacking an unrelated party with a snare that could easily sever a limb or two barbaric would be an understatement. But Jinto quickly squashed his pangs of conscience. If that happens, it happens. He snapped a finger. Sometimes, civilians get maimed and killed in war. And so Jinto left for the city. Leifir remained sitting, holding one knee. She was tuning into the airwaves of this land of Klasbiel through her CompuWatch. And she thought Jinto's accent was bad. The language spoken on this planet was barely even Baranu. There were traces of Baranu vocabulary, and it did have a more refined ring than the language of the united humankind, but it was all a bunch of unintelligible mumbo-jumbo. She soon ran out of patience attempting to follow along. As she absent-mindedly watched the outside world get brighter, her mind dwelled on how she'd been left all alone. She was out of her element. Since they'd come aground, it had been Jinto calling all of the shots. This did not amuse her. Until she got Jinto aboard an Empire menu interstellar ship, she could not say she'd completed her mission. She had to protect him and the navigation log at all costs. Despite that, she felt as though Jinto was protecting her, a reality she was loath to accept. What angered her the most, however, was how much better things seemed to be going after she'd ceded the initiative to him. Am I relying on him? Should I? She asked herself. Considering how flustered he'd been with her in space, she never thought him a particularly dependable individual. She laid her head sideways against her raised knee. Earlier, she'd put up a brave front, acted tough in front of him. But she was tired. So tired. She'd even acknowledge her cat Horia was one of her gene providers if it could somehow strip her muscles of all the lactic acid. The surface gravity on Klasbiel was comparable to most other terrestrial worlds, but twice the Demon gravity level to which the Ov were accustomed. Leifir had endured upwards of 10 times the G-forces, yes, but she was always sprawled on a specially crafted seat designed to cushion her back during times of heavy acceleration. While the surface only clocked in at 2 Demon, it was her first time moving about in heightened gravity for such a long time. Naturally, she couldn't be expected to keep a steady pace without ever tiring, but she felt pathetic nonetheless. The bodies of Ov-kind were expressly engineered to allow them some freedom of movement even during high acceleration. Her ancestors hadn't had the luxury of gravity control systems, nor did they complain. The Star Forces had equipped the vessel with an emergency surface landing function, but she'd never given much thought to what that would precipitate. There wasn't usually a planet with a breathable atmosphere conveniently close by when a ship was caught in danger, after all. It was little wonder, then, that her scenario hadn't cropped up in her training much. She'd learned how to land the ship, but all that was projected for the aftermath was to stay in place and await rescue. Waiting for rescue in this particular situation, however, was a fool's errand. As a mere trainee star pilot, she was not privy to Star Forces soldier deployment, but she reckoned it'd take 10 days at the very shortest. She'd have to prepare herself for it taking more than twice as long. She'd even have to make peace with the possibility that they'd never come. They might run out of food or get captured by those of the enemy army who pursued defeated soldiers. She had no choice but to get through this while counting on Jinto, no matter how dependable he truly proved to be. A smile played at her lips as she nodded off. He's been full of life ever since we landed on a surface. Even though the danger now exceeded what they faced back at the barony of Febdash. When she awoke and noticed Jinto was absent, her mind ran wild. She was beset not by the fear she'd failed in her mission, but rather by the uncertainty of what to do from that point forward. As hard as it was to believe, Leifir was relying on him. Leifir, a royal princess of the Empire. Depending on another. But so be it. For there was no one else in a 100 light-year radius she could trust.